Today I am at the head of the strongest army in the world, the most gigantic air force and of a proud navy. Behind and around me stands the party with which I became great and which has become great through me. The American president and his plutocratic clique have mocked us as the have-nots. That is true, but the have-nots will see to it that they are not robbed of the little they have. Those most ominous words were spoken by none other than Adolf Hitler on the 11th of December 1941, following the official German declaration of war on the US earlier that same day. But while ominous, those words would go on to be naught but pure hokum, because not even 4 years later, millions of pairs of American boots would be firmly planted on German soil, following the complete and unconditional surrender of the country's forces on the 8th of May 1945. And yet, Hitler spoke such a big game back in 1941, didn't he? And knowing this, one can't naturally help but wonder, what did his military actually do to try and take the fight to their enemies across the pond? And the answer to that question is that they both did a hell of a lot and a whole lot of nothing. Because while the German military had no shortage of schemes aimed at giving Uncle Sam a firm shoeing, none of them ever actually amounted to anything meaningful. It was all a veritable labyrinth of lacklustre. And if after hearing that you find yourself with a want to navigate said labyrinth and discover what exactly it was that they did, then worry not, folks, because we've taken the liberty of reading the books and breaking down all of Germany's efforts into 3 handy dandy overarching categories: the sneaky stuff, the aerial stuff, and the underwater stuff. So let's get started and see what it was all about. All of Germany's covert sabotage efforts against the US really were one of a muchness. After all, there are only so many ways that you can deploy agents into a country for the purposes of making a productive nuisance of themselves. So with that in mind, rather than rattling off a big list of operations and giving you tiny snippets of their stories, let's instead focus on just one archetypal operation and really pull it apart, thus allowing us to both tell you a detailed and interesting story and give you a general idea all at the same time. As for the specific operation we'll be focusing on, that would be Operation Pastorious. Initiated in June 1942, it had a simple enough goal: to cause economic havoc and thus slow down the raging torrent of military material that was flowing out of the US factories. A big and clever idea indeed, given that the US was nothing short of an industrial juggernaut at that time. The operation's name was given by Wilhelm Canaris, who in 1942 was serving both as Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, Nazi Germany's navy, and as the chief of the Abwehr, its military intelligence service. He chose the name Pastorious in honor of Francis Pastorius, the founder of the very originally named Germantown, the first permanent German settlement in the Americas. Given that Germantown became a gateway for later German emigration and thus influence into the Americas, the name was nothing if not apt. As for those who would be executing the operation, that burden would fall to 8 German men who had previously lived in the US. 2 of them, specifically Ernst Berger and Herbert Haupt, also happened to be dual US-German nationals, and the other 6, Edward Curling, George Dasch, Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Werner Thiel, and Hermann Nerber, all had just previously worked in the US in various capacities. Notably too, none of these men had any prior military experience, with the exception of Nerber, who had been serving with an unknown unit of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front before being drafted into the Abwehr following his invaliding out with injuries sustained to his right eye and leg. The 8 of them were given 3 weeks of intense espionage training at an Abwehr academy on the outskirts of Berlin, with the covert curriculum focusing on the manufacturing and use of improvised explosives, as well as delayed timing detonators. A lot of time was also spent developing their backstories, which were intended to be absolutely watertight and inspire not even the slightest raising of an eyebrow amongst even the most inquisitive minds. And to really make sure their stories were believable, they were also all issued with counterfeit birth certificates, social security cards, draft deferment cards, driver's licenses, as well as $175,000 USD between them, which is about $3.3 million now, adjusted for inflation. Interestingly, despite being a carefully considered cohort and having had no expense spared on kitting them out, they were not exactly what you would call a professional bunch, as before they even made land in the US, blunders were abound. Dash, for example, managed to leave confidential documents on a train and, while trying to clean the mess up, managed to land himself in a Gestapo office for delivering a most enthusiastic Hail Hitler, and he was the group's leader. Then there was Heinck, who, while on the patrol for Totti at Douaumont bar in Paris, blurted out loud that he was a spy in an attempt to seal the deal with an unenthusiastic Fräulein. And if you happen to be wondering, no, she didn't go home with him. So yeah, James Bond they most certainly were not. Eventually, however, they were loaded up onto the U-boats that were to insert them in the US, having gone straight to it from the pub, at least according to Michael Dobbs in Saboteurs, the Nazi Raid on America. The first one, U-202, arrived on the night of the 12th through 13th of June 1942, and put Dash, Berger, Quirin and Heinck ashore at Amagansett, New York State. They came ashore wearing Kriegsmarine uniforms. This may sound weird, but it was a quite rational and calculated move, because that way, if they were intercepted, they'd be classified as prisoners of war rather than spies, and thus avoid the suffocating embrace of the hangman's rope. Unfortunately for them, however, an interception is exactly what happened to them, as they were spotted by a member of the Coast Guard by the name of John Cullen. Fortunately, he was a man of the lax scruples, and so the offer of a cheeky $300 bribe, just shy of 6,000 USD adjusted for inflation, made him avert his gaze easily enough. He did at least report the incident, however, not mentioning the bribe, of course. This brought a search team down to the beach the following morning, who soon enough found the Kriegsmarine uniforms buried in the sand, alongside a lot of explosives. It didn't exactly take an expert to piece together what was happening, and so the search was on, with an FBI manhunt for the 4 spies being launched immediately. The other 4 came ashore on the 16th of June, having been dropped off by U-584 at Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. Their landing was an incident-free one, and so they started heading north, where they were to meet up with the other group at a hotel in Cincinnati. They would never make it there, however. The encounter with the Coast Guard had made Dash a nervous wreck, and eventually he confronted Berger with his concerns, rather dramatically opening the window of their room and telling him that if he disagreed with what he was about to say, quote, "Only one of us will walk out that door, the other will fly out this window." Berger, who was rather partial to the whole being alive thing, agreed to join Dash in reporting the plot to the FBI, hoping that he'd be able to wriggle out of any punishment if he defected. And unfortunately for Berger and Dash, while President Roosevelt was initially furious over the plot and wanted them all summarily executed, he eventually calmed down and cooled his tone, appreciating the fact that they hadn't actually done anything yet and had voluntarily handed themselves in after all. With that in mind, on the 1st of August, when their trial concluded, Roosevelt personally commuted Berger's sentence to life in prison and Dash's to 30 years. The other 6 received no such mercy, however, and they all went to the chair on the 8th of August. The plan, that hadn't even managed to sabotage so much as a bus stop, had been an absolute disaster, and Hitler, being the prone to anger sort of chap that he was blind with rage when news of the failure reached him. He immediately inserted his size 9.5s into Canaris's backside and publicly admonished him. The whole mess had left such a sour taste in the Germans' mouth that they would never again attempt a sabotage operation on US soil. In fact, further to that, agents would only ever be dispatched to the US once more, period, and even then, it was over 2 years later in November 1944, and only to gather some intelligence on US manufacturing. Incidentally, that one ended up being as bungled as Operation Pastorious, as one of the agents, rather than executing the mission, headed up to Manhattan, blew all the operation's money on a month's worth of debauchery, and then handed himself in to the FBI, which soon led to the rounding up of all other agents before even so much as a newspaper could be sent back to Germany. In summary, German efforts at sabotaging the US were an abject disaster. But that, of course, was just one of the many methods they tried, so now let's move and have a look at another: aerial bombing. The geography buffs watching no doubt know that the US is rather far away from Germany. Call it 5,000-ish miles to the east coast and 6,000 miles-ish to the west coast, just for the sake of having nice and easy to work with figures in our minds. These distances presented quite the problem to the Luftwaffe when they found themselves overcome with the burning desire to blow the out of the US because their medium bombers, which constituted the vast bulk of their bomber force, simply couldn't cover the distance. Take this, for example, the Heinkel 111, a normal one of these, had a maximum range of give or take 1,400 miles. Not even enough to get halfway there, never mind there and back. And it was even worse for the Junkers 88 too, which on average could just about managed to cover 1,100 miles before it ran out of fuel. Even their biggest bombers, which, although much rarer, the Luftwaffe absolutely did have, they weren't up to the task. Take the Focke-Wulf 200 for example. Even with its fuel tanks being way bigger than its medium-sized siblings, it could just about cover 2,200 miles before it burnt through all of its go juice. Even the Heinkel 177, the most advanced and thus longest range heavy bomber that Germany could ever put into mass production, could only manage 3,700 miles. Not even enough for a one-way trip. It just was no good. Even with the defeat of France, which afforded Germany a cheeky bit more land to the west from which it could launch missions against the US, even with that, they just didn't have anything that could pull it off. If they were ever to drop bombs on the US, there was nothing for it. They would have to go back to the drawing board and build, totally from scratch, the single most advanced and longest range bomber the world had ever seen. And thus, the America Bomber project was initiated in April 1942. All of the big boys of the German aviation industry were given the brief and told that there was a juicy contract available for whoever produced the best design. And so they duly got to work producing some preliminary proposals, 4 of which appeared in total. Messerschmitt were the first to deliver, slapping the drawings of their 264 down on Hermann Göring's desk in May 1942, not even a month after the project's initiation. It was envisaged as a 4-engine bomber that could manage just shy of 9,000 miles with a 6,600 pound bomb load, or just over 5,000 miles with a 13,200 pound bomb load. Next up was Junkers, who submitted the proposal for their 390 not even a fortnight later. This was to be an absolute unit of a bomber, packing 6 engines and able to carry an insane 22,000 pound bomb load, a marathon shy of 5,000 miles. Then there was the Heinkel 277, which was submitted in February 1943 and was a derivative of the Heinkel 177 we mentioned earlier. It kept the 4-engine configuration of its shorter-ranged younger sibling and was promised to be able to carry 12,300 pounds of bombs at a range of 3,700 miles and 6,600 pounds for 6,900 miles. Finally, there was the Focke-Wulf 400 on March 1943. This was to be another 6-engine big boy, one able to carry a maximum of 22,000 pounds worth of bombs up to 9,000 miles. We got this figure from the Book of Secret Bombers of the Third Reich by Dan Sharp. We thought we'd give you the source for this one because these figures seem optimistic, to say the least, and so we wanted to be open about where we got our information from. Despite having all of these promising designs to choose from, however, the America Bomber program would ultimately produce the sum total of bugger all. The plug being pulled on it in July 1944, and without a single bomb having been dropped on American soil. There were 2 main reasons for this. Firstly, there were the technical challenges, many of which simply didn't seem solvable during wartime. Making meaty enough undercarriages and control surfaces, for example, was a constant problem for many of the proposed aircraft once work on them began. Then there was the inevitable need for using rocket-assisted takeoff for getting such lumbering beasts off the ground reliably, which many Luftwaffe bigwigs feared would simply be too dangerous. Then there was the shift in strategic priorities. Back in 1942, when the war was going reasonably well for Germany, the idea of throwing a few punches at the US mainland was a most big and clever idea, but come 1944, when the Soviet army was closing on the German heartland and the British and American bombers were dropping bombs day and night, an idea like the America Bomber, which was only ever going to realistically offer a propaganda victory at best, simply wasn't viable. They needed more rifles and tanks, far more than they needed to get the Americans' feathers ruffled. Finally, and closely related to our last point, there was also just the cost of the project, which was simply astronomical. Even in the good times, our sources don't go into exact figures, but put it this way. The Boeing B-29, America's big and tarty high-tech bomber from the war, cost a staggering $3 billion to develop and produce in World War II money. This is a project that is roughly half as expensive as the Manhattan Project that made the first nuclear bombs. And so then, for those reasons, the project found itself on the scrap heap. A few prototypes did manage to get made before it was axed, however, with the Messerschmitt 264 having 3 units produced and 2 for the Junkers 390, but that was it. So with that done, let us now move on to a new chapter and discuss the final way in which the Nazis attempted to attack the US with their terrifying fleet of U-boats. A disclaimer before we dive into this chapter. Yes, we know that technically the U-boat campaign wasn't an attack on the US itself, per se, but rather on the waters just outside of it. But we're going to count it, partly because it's just so bloody interesting, if we do say so ourselves, and so we want to talk about it. But also because it has a deep impact on the US economy and a very significant psychological effect on the American public. So while it might not be bombing New York or spies blowing up factories, we are totally still counting it. It all began on the 11th of December 1941, the very day that Germany declared war on the US, with U-boats already at sea being immediately informed that anything flying the Stars and Stripes was now an authorized target. By this time, the U-boats had already earned themselves quite the fearsome reputation, having been plying their wicked trade against other Allied shipping for well over 2 years at that point. So bad had it been for the British that in the first 4 months of the war, they'd sunk over 800,000 tons of British shipping. And note we said British specifically, not Allied. The overall figure was even bigger still. And seeing as how World War II was already 2 years deep when the US were dragged into it by the Japanese and German declarations of war, the British had had plenty of time to learn some very harsh lessons concerning exactly how modern naval warfare was to be fought. As a result of these lessons, they quickly reintroduced and began further refining the convoy system they used back in World War I. That being a system in which groups of merchant ships travelled together, escorted by naval ships, and oftentimes armed aircraft to boot. This, to simplify the theory a bit, concentrated the escorting vessels and made sure that when a U-boat did eventually appear, which was ultimately a relatively rare event in the grand scheme of things, anyway, when they did appear, the greatest possible number of depth charges would be getting to drop on it, thus making sure it was blown apart and the threat it posed neutralised with all possible haste. The US, by comparison, despite having been a combatant in the First World War themselves, and despite the British trying to convey the convoy system very clearly, really dragged their heels with implementing it themselves, with their first convoy not setting sail until the 14th of May 1942, nearly half a year after the U-boats first formally began turning their torpedoes on them. Naturally then, this period turned into an abject massacre for US shipping, with 3.1 million tons of Allied shipping being lost in total, the vast majority of which was American. So bad was it, in fact, that the Germans took to calling this period the second happy time and American shooting season, all because they were having such a grand old time of it, roaming the waves and sinking American shipping with such ease. We have someone who we can blame for this too, and that would be this man, Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the US fleet. He strongly resisted the implementation of convoy systems, chiefly because he direly underestimated the U-boat threat, despite his daily briefings making him very much aware of just how much shipping they were losing. Instead, in his mind, the way forward was to use naval ships for offensive operations in which U-boats were specifically hunted down, rather than just being used to cover merchant shipping and deal with them as and when they appeared. Totally oblivious to the fact that literally all that mattered when it came to U-boats was that they weren't proactively sinking ships. How many were actually out there was ultimately a moot point. Fortunately, however, sense finally got through to King, and with him finally seeing sense on the matter of convoys, the second happy time came to an end, with most historians placing the end date sometime around August 1942. The U-boats would go on to be a lingering menace for the remainder of the war, but never again would they have the catastrophic impact on the US as they had back in early to mid 1942. From there on in, losses were comparatively minimal, and although they were all a human tragedy, of course, those that were lost didn't matter strategically, because from mid-1943, thanks to the Liberty ship, a cheap and cheerful cargo ship design that could be quickly pumped out of the dockyards, the US was building ships faster than the U-boats could sink them, making the U-boat campaign absolutely moot. And that pretty much was it. It was also all that it could ever be. Despite what many, admittedly rather interesting works of historical fiction tell us, Germany was never in a position to invade the US, and nor could it ever have been, no matter how well its war went for it. This could be a whole video just in and of itself, but let us sum it up by saying this. Germany couldn't even get over 18 miles of English Channel due to a total failure in its navy and advanced logistics. How the hell were they ever going to manage it over nearly 5,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean? It was just an impossibility, simple as. And as a result, the efforts we learned about today were as far as it ever went.